New York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
What happens when a celebrated author, Muhammed Ali's official biographer no less, turns his talents to putting his mother's century-long life down on paper? We'll get a preview of this special and very honest story next. But first, hello history lovers and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Karayanis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio. You can find me at historyauthor.com or across social media platforms. And even though this is an audio-only interview, please do follow our time travel adventures on our YouTube channel. Plus, you can read my columns in the New York Sun, including a review of today's book that is going to hit on Mother's Day. You can get my analysis of current events through the lens of what I've learned from all of the history books I've read and the over 250 authors I've interviewed. In this episode, our time machine welcomes aboard Thomas Hauser. He's the author of My Mother and Me, a memoir. He's also a former writer for the New York Sun. I didn't know that until we began talking. So right away, I felt like we were old friends. And right away, when I started reading My Mother and Me, I felt like I knew Eleanor Nordlinger Hauser. And I felt like I wanted to get to know her more. And I mourned that she passed away last year at 96, and I didn't get to meet her. Through this book, though, I was able to experience her life of successes and failures, meeting the march of years with resilience and grace. She eventually made her peace with the fact that, as we all do, she had run out of tomorrows. Thomas Hauser is an author of fiction and nonfiction books that are bestsellers the world over. These include Final Warning, The Legacy of Chernobyl, and Muhammed Ali, His Life and Times. Thanks to his great writing and relationship with the champ, Thomas Hauser has been inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame. Okay, now that we've set the table for a book that's perfect for Mother's Day or any other holiday you're looking to give a special gift to the reader or non-reader in your life, let's join Thomas Hauser to hear him tell stories of My Mother and Me. And here we are with Thomas Hauser joining us with the most personal book of his storied career, My Mother and Me, a memoir. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with the History Author Show, sir.
It's nice to be with you.
Your book, not just is it timely because we're releasing this and talking about this on the weekend of Mother's Day, but it is a story that I think is so important when you get together for these kind of events. For me, Greek Orthodox, our Easter was just last week. People get together with family, and only after they're gone do they start thinking, boy, I wish I'd asked those questions. I wish I'd gone to, as you describe in My Mother and Me, that aging photo album, back when we had photo albums in your mother's day and in our day, and asked who these people were, what is happening here, what's the event. And when someone is gone, that's too late. You were always thinking of this. You begin My Mother and Me with the line, I've known for years I would write this book. So you were more conscious of that than I think a lot of people do, avoided that regret. Describe to me how you looked at Ellie Hauser's life through an author's eyes rather than a son's eyes, and you decided that readers would enjoy this journey and maybe they would think about, just turn on that phone. We all have a recorder now and talk to your mother, your grandmother, somebody who's older about their life.
Well, first, I'll always look at my mother through a son's eyes, not an author's eyes. At the same time, the challenge I faced in writing My Mother and Me was to write a book that would be of interest beyond the people who know me or knew my mother. And I think I've done that through the themes that are developed in the book and in the recounting of the very interesting life that my mother lived. My mother lived to age 96. She had a long, privileged life with some rough spots along the way, as all of us have. And it wasn't so much a question of interviewing her for the book over time. It's just the natural conversations that we had over the many years. And I guess about 5 or 6 years, maybe a little longer, before my mother died, I knew that I wanted to write this book. I actually discussed writing the book with her. I didn't want to begin writing it while she was alive, because that would have meant living with the shadow of her death every day. But I began taking notes, as I said, maybe 5, 6 years before my mother died, as to things I might want to incorporate in the book later on. And with one exception, I think I discussed in detail with her all the themes I'd return to later. When I started writing this book, I said to myself, I'm going to come across issue after issue, event after event, where I say to myself, damn, I wish I'd discussed this more with my mother.
Yeah.
And the only time that really surfaced is that when I was 13, my father had a very serious breakdown, psychiatric breakdown, and he was really seriously impaired for the better part of 8 years. As I said, I was 13 when it began. And in retrospect, I wish that I had asked my mother more about how she coped with those years and experienced those years from her point of view. But beyond that, I really discussed my mother's life with her in such detail over the years that it was more a question of putting my thoughts and memories and insights together when I began to write.
And it makes sense to me, having read My Mother and Me now, because you talk about, as your mother aged, your relationship grew into what you describe as people with identities that went beyond those familial bonds. And you get to know somebody if you ask those questions when they're available to ask them, because you were very blessed to have a mother that you could speak with and that you were close geographically to, that you could visit, you could be there with her. What do you hope people pick up from this story, that if they are fortunate enough to have parents, grandparents with them, that when they get to what you describe as mature adulthood, which I'm not sure if I like that to describe myself, but I guess I'm in it, that will gain from following you on this journey? I always talk about that hyphen on the gravestone between the year someone was born and when they died. You're able to walk on that hyphen with your mother, and I'm sure that is comforting for you to feel like you really knew her and that you may have left some things unsaid, unasked, but boy, you had a great relationship. So what do you hope readers will take from that story?
Well, what I hope first and foremost that readers take from this book is a portrait of an understanding of who my mother was. This book, in a sense, was my last gift to my mother. The reality of life is that most of us are completely gone and forgotten 50, 75 years after we die. We become names on a family tree and maybe photographs and old albums. And I wanted my mother to have this marker so people would know who she was. First, my sense is, and what I tried to do with My Mother and Me is it's an entertaining read. My mother is somebody who people will like to get to know like they would a character on their favorite TV show. There are also different themes that run through the book that people can identify with. One of them, which you just alluded to, is that when we're young, we view our parents as our parents. That's the only identity that they have. They're our mother, our father. And over time, as we mature, we begin to understand that they are people with identities apart from that. And you have to get outside that box and look at your parents as individuals with a life apart from their relationship with you, just like parents have to understand that their children grow up. And I've heard people say you have children to let them free. So that's one of the themes in the book, how relationships change and evolve over time. It's also a book, certainly in the end stages, about watching somebody you love grow old and then very old and finally reach a point in their life where they feel that they've lived long enough and are ready to die. And that can be very sad, but it's a natural evolution, living and then dying. One of the things that makes life so precious is that it does come to an end. But rather than dwell on the sad, what I've tried to do for most of the book is paint a portrait of a very vibrant woman who had a wonderful life. And there are a lot of stories that are told in the book, memories that are recounted that reinforce that.
Certainly, I can agree, back you up, having read through it. It's one of those books where you think, well, is this just going to be a story of somebody's mother who I never met? Maybe I won't be interested in this. Is it going to hold my attention for a full book? Why would I want to read it? And first of all, you're a talented writer, so you can make things interesting. That's the job. Also, you begin with something that I think is very alluring and very tempting to people, and that's that you say your mother told you to be honest about her life, not make her out to be a saint. And I think when people do that in a memoir, it makes us feel bad a little of ourselves. We say, well, this isn't really realistic. Jackie Gleason had a friend of his, one of his drinking buddies, write a book about him, and it was a little too positive. And one thing they left out was the infidelity, and that's not the case here. And people have marriages that have trouble, they grow apart, they get married very, very young in your mother's day. Were you able to deal with that as easily as it seems on the page, or were there times when you did want to look at her as a son, as a young boy, and not as an author, which you said you do, and put her up on a pedestal and keep those things private? Or was that very easy for you to do because she gave you the freedom to say, tell my story, warts and all?
Well, my mother encouraged me to be honest in writing the book that she knew I would write, and that included writing about her own flaws. She didn't ask that I recount every embarrassing detail about every person in our family, and I didn't. People are entitled to a zone of privacy in life and in death, but there's plenty of grist for the mill in the book. One of the key points in the book is that both my parents had affairs, which ultimately led to the disintegration of the marriage. The most dramatic one, and the first affair was my father's, and I didn't know this until much later in life. Then, when my mother was in her early 60s and locked in a marriage that in many ways was very unfulfilling to her, an old high school boyfriend, not an old high school boyfriend, the old high school boyfriend,
yeah,
resurfaced in her life.
Buddy, right?
Buddy had carried a torch for her for years. He had always been in my mother's thoughts, and they resumed their relationship in what was a very dramatic and trying time for our family, and I would assume for Buddy's family as well. And one of the things I was able to draw upon in writing the book was about a month before my mother died. I was over at her apartment talking with her, and she asked me, there's a file on the shelf in the closet in the den. Do you know the one I'm talking about? And I did. And she asked, could you bring it to me? And I did. It was this big manila folder, actually. And she reached in it and took out well over 100 letters. And she said to me, these are the letters that Bud and I wrote to each other when we resumed our relationship, because when they did, she was in New York and he was in London. He had been the London correspondent for the New York Times and was living over there at that point in time. This was before email, and they sent well over 100 letters to each other. He had kept all the letters she sent. She had kept all the letters he sent. And she said to me, they're yours. Use them in your book. I trust you. Do whatever you think is appropriate with them. And in a way, it was a little like the Bridges of Madison County, where the son and daughter get together after their mother's death and they're reading their mother's diary, and they understand now about this marvelous affair she had with Clint Eastwood. Well, here I already knew about the affair, but this really documented it. Ultimately, my mother left my father to live with Bud. Then Bud developed lung cancer. She was his primary caretaker until he died. And it was obviously a very difficult time for everybody. Then, subsequent to Bud dying, my father had one of those horrible strokes that destroyed the good part of his life. And even though my mother and father were no longer living together, she became his primary caretaker. She took on the responsibility in a very caring, loving way for his well-being. She did not want him in a nursing home. She set him up in an apartment in the building that she lived in. He had 24-hour-a-day care. She had lunch or dinner with him at least once every day. And that actually was a period where my mother and I grew much closer because I admired and respected all the things that she was doing to care for my father during that time. She didn't just say, "Oh, that's so sad," and go on with her life. She really made that the centerpiece of her life. And it was important to her that I was with her every step of the way. So that's really a full chapter in the book. And it certainly says a lot about my mother's character.
And not to carry bitterness, never mind just saying, oh, that's terrible. A lot of people go through a divorce, especially where there's infidelity involved, and they really let themselves get dragged down a path where we all do it. It's just human. To me, that was a Herculean effort, especially since you get to know your mother. And so then you're kind of rooting for her, even though you see that the marriage is just not right for either of them. But still, you kind of, not that you make your father the villain of the piece, but it would be understandable if she was just tapped out and said, forget it. Not my problem. So that's the kind of story. I think that's why we read history, read memoirs. And I always say when history is watching us, it sees those moments. And the human moments where we stumble, and your mother has those, are important too. But that was, I thought, really special and inspiring. I read stories and I say, I want to be like that person. That's the way to be. You're just inspired by the goodness of it. And I was here in My Mother and Me.
Well, she was a good woman. When all is said and done, she had a strong moral fiber. She believed in treating people right. She cared about people. When my mother asked people about themselves, she genuinely wanted to know the answer. She was a people person, and that stretched across all boundaries of, race, gender, religion, class. I remember walking with her once, and we passed a homeless person sitting on the street. It was a woman, sitting next to two huge bags, these 50-gallon black plastic garbage bags that were piled high with whatever her belongings were. And my mother turned to me and said, "I wonder what's in those bags." This woman was a person to my mother, and she really wanted to know more about her life.
And that's in New York, I would assume, in Manhattan. She lived there. It's so easy for people to become invisible. Never mind the homeless, the most invisible of all. But I love that. I love that she was watching and so engaged with the world around her.
Yeah, one of the things that infuriated her was when people said, contemporaries of hers, well, I don't really care about global warming because I'll be gone when the real trouble hits. And that infuriated her because she felt that she was a small link in this chain that we call civilization. And, just the glories of history, from the pyramids to the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, all these wonderful periods of time. And she felt she had a role in that. And she certainly had the feeling that she wanted this grand phenomenon to go on long after she was gone. She felt a connection to other people and humanity as a whole.
You spoke about two things there. One is, if you are reading those letters, and you're fortunate that Buddy's letters were typewritten,
yes.
And your mother had nice handwriting. So one more reason to teach kids cursive, I guess.
I guess so. Yeah. No, my mother her handwriting was always easy to read right until the very end. The few times that Bud scrawled notations in his own handwriting on his typewritten letters, I mean, it took longer to read a one-sentence notation than it did to read a whole typed letter. So, yeah, the historian in me is very happy that Bud typed his letters.
And you mentioned your mother's honesty. It reminded me of something you refer to as the Sara Lee banana cake incident.
Oh.
And there's a couple of flashbulb memories you have. There's that, and there's a little girl who sings a particularly not kind poem to you, but I'll leave that for people to pick up and read for themselves when they read My Mother and Me. But this banana cake incident and that honesty that your mother had, I wanted to ask you to relay that and how this small moment, and I think this is so important to people in general, especially when dealing with children, that you forget how much influence you can have as an adult never mind a parent, on somebody who's young with just a little moment. And this was a little moment with your mother. So tell that story.
Well, it's funny how isolated incidents are lodged somewhere in our memory. And we might not think about them for decades, and then suddenly they pop up. And when I was writing My Mother and Me, this one popped up. I was probably 14 years old, I'm going to guess. And this was all complicated by the fact that I was a fat kid when I was little, when I was young. So what I ate could be a very sensitive issue. Later on, I got tall, I thinned out, but weight was an issue. And we used to have dinner as a family when my father got home from work around 7 o'clock. And, maybe an hour before I was hungry, and I went into the kitchen, and there was a Sara Lee banana cake in the refrigerator. And I opened it up, and I sliced off a piece of cake and ate it and put it back in the refrigerator. And then my mother said to me, not long after that, well before dinner, why did you just eat banana cake? And we're having dinner, in less than an hour. And I don't know why I lied, but I did. I said, maybe it just tied into the sensitivities that I talked about before. And I said, I didn't. And she said, yes, I did. And I said, no, I didn't. She said, yes, you did. And before you dig yourself in any deeper, she said, and she pointed to the kitchen counter. Well, Sara Lee banana cakes have this thin sheet of wax paper, I guess it's on top of the cake inside the container. And I had left the wax paper on the counter. So that seemed, and she said to me, I don't mind that you ate the piece of cake. I do mind that you're lying to me. And that seemed like a good time to confess, when confronted with a wax paper, that yes, I had Sara Lee banana cake. It was really a good lesson for me as an adolescent about telling the truth, and certainly, not to lie about stupid little things, but also, just the disappointment that was clear in my mother over the fact that I had lied to her also taught me a lesson. And, generally, if you have to lie about something, you shouldn't have done it. And then, you go on through life a little further and you realize that if you're lucky, that lies of omission are just as bad as lies, outright misstatements. And lies breed mistrust. And if you can't trust somebody, there's not a whole lot there.
You'd mentioned my mother was blessed with the unearned privilege of good looks. And then it became clear to me in the book, as in that moment, and she didn't coast through life as a lot of pretty people do, never mind a lot of people that we don't consider pretty, just a lot of people in general. But how did that guide the course of her life? Because she grows up here. She's born in 1925, so she's a toddler in the Roaring '20s. She's a teen in the Great Depression and adult in World War II. How does that affect her life? How does she, I guess, maybe overcome what could be a trap a little bit? We all know a lot of pretty people who, as I said, just coast by on their looks. How did that guide the course of her life? And she refused to just rest on that and just be another one of these women who, God bless them, we all love them. Mothers who just got married, that was the limit of their life. They were happy with that. That was fine for them, but not for her. So how did that impact the course of her life?
Well, first, there's a photograph of my mother on the cover of My Mother and Me. And for anyone who wants to see what she looked like at age 19, they can go to Amazon. They don't even have to buy the book. They can just look at the cover of the book, and there it is, and they'll see what you're talking about. There are certain things that are magnets for attention. Celebrity status is a magnet for attention. Large sums of money can be a powerful aphrodisiac. When a person is famous or rich or good looking, people tend to want to be in their orbit. That can make life easier, but it can also make life more complicated. And my mother never let her looks define who she was. She started to turn gray and then stopped dyeing her hair at age 50. She never had any cosmetic surgery as she got older. She drew people in with her decency, her interest in other people, her intellect, and maybe certainly men paid more attention to her because of her looks, but that was not her calling card. And as I write early on, that good looks are an unearned privilege, and she never abused that privilege.
You're enjoying my conversation with Thomas Hauser. He's the author of My Mother and Me, a memoir. You can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at thehistoryauthor.com page for this episode, and you can get a look at his mother. One of those covers of a book that the person really seems like they could speak to you, and you almost see the person's entire life in that little snapshot of a second. It's really a perfect picture that you chose for the cover of that book. I wonder, did you have to go through a lot of different versions? Did you ever have a doubt what picture you were going to use, and what moment of that of your mother's life was that picture that's on the cover?
My mother was 19 years old when she got married, and that was the photograph that was taken and used for the announcement of her engagement in the New York Times. She was working for the New Yorker at the time, and she had gone to Wellesley for 1 year, hated it, dropped out, got a job at the New Yorker. And Brendan Gill, who was one of the writers for the New Yorker at that point in time, took the photograph out of the New York Times and posted it on the bulletin board in the New Yorker. And from the very beginning, I knew that that was the photograph I wanted on the cover of the book, because that was my mother, in one incarnation of her mother. And what I have had people say to me is that they look at this book, they look at the cover, and their reaction is, wow, I want to open this book and read about this person. It really invites a person in, which is the sort of person that she was. She invited people into her life. I don't mean that she stopped and dealt with every person she came in contact with, but when she was with somebody, that person always felt they had her full attention. She wasn't looking over their shoulder for somebody more interesting or more important to talk with. As I said earlier, she was a real people person.
What a great way to describe her. I love that. Your mother seems like somebody who, just by being willing to share her story, caring enough to do it after she was gone, is inviting us to look in those trash bags of her life and see what was in there and get this view of a person that we never met in life, but boy, we sure wish we had met her by the end of the book, and we feel like we did by the end of the book. You mentioned a therapist in My Mother and Me saying you had put a lot of varnish over your feelings in your early years. What spots in the book do you hope jump out at people, at readers, because it was difficult, it was tough, maybe even painful to strip off the varnish and leave the wood bare?
Well, first, I guess I should explain why I had an occasion to quote a therapist. I realized early on that I could not write about my mother and our relationship without also writing about me. And that's what I do. In many ways, this is a memoir not about my mother, but about myself. When I was 39 years old, I guess it was, I wasn't as happy as I felt I should be. And a big part of that was I had always told myself that, someday I'd get married, I'd have children, the typical checklist of things. And it hadn't happened. I was a serial monogamist. I'd had a number of good relationships, but at that point in time, I was in a relationship with a remarkable woman, and inside some part of me knew that I wasn't going to marry her. I lived with a woman once, but again, that didn't lead to marriage. And I said to myself, okay, let's figure out what's going on here. And going into therapy made me a happier person, and I think also a better person. And I came to realize that I was living a life that was right for me. One of the things that's dealt with in the book, as I mentioned earlier, is my father's breakdown. And that just doesn't come out of the blue. There are a lot of things in the home that lead up to that. And one of the first things the therapist said to me when I started working with him, and I was fortunate. First, therapy works if you're at a point in your life where you're receptive to it, but you also need a good therapist. And I had a wonderful therapist. And he said to me, you put a lot of varnish over your feelings when you were young as a defense mechanism, as a means of coping for all the things that were going wrong in my life at that point in time as a kid. And what we have to do is strip some of that away. That's what a good therapist does. And you get to the core and then you rebuild.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring up that you're the official biographer of Muhammad Ali. And your mother, now it's no surprise to any of us listening, much less reading My Mother and Me, that she would want to meet him because she would find him interesting, as she found everybody interesting, I guess. So when they meet, I'd like you to just tell that story, and with an eye towards that wider story of what it tells us about both of them, about the champ and about your mother.
That was a wonderful moment. First, I don't think I'll ever have a professional project that brings me as much joy as the time I spent working with Muhammad Ali did. I had a room in his home in Berrien Springs, Michigan, which is where he lived at the time, and I'd go out to spend 5-6 days at a time there. He was in my apartment probably a dozen times, when we were working on the book, and just watch. It's quite an experience to sit in the sofa in your living room watching a tape of the Rumble in the Jungle with Muhammad Ali sitting beside you.
Yeah.
That's something you remember for sure. Funny, I remember once he was over and he got tired and he wanted to take a nap. So he went in and took a nap on my bed. So I can tell people now, I can point to my bed and say, Muhammad Ali slept here. Anyway, my mother, like everybody else, wanted to meet Muhammad. So I invited her over to my apartment one day when we were, watching some fight films for the book. And she came over. He got up to meet her in the foyer when she came into the apartment. And she looked at him. And when you meet Muhammad Ali, particularly in those days, when he was still pretty healthy and just extraordinarily good looking, there's this, oh my God factor. And she looked at him, and the first thing she said was, "You're so much bigger than I thought you'd be." And being Muhammad, he looked at her and said, "Did you call me a," and then he used a word that starts with N and rhymes with bigger that one really shouldn't say on the air. And she said, "No, I said bigger." And he started pounding his fist into the palm of his hand, advancing towards her with this menacing look, saying, "You called me a," and there was that word again. And at that point, as I say in the book, my mother might have been forgiven if she had thought life would have been simpler if I'd kept my job as a lawyer on Wall Street rather than becoming a freelance writer. And just when Muhammad was almost on top of her, his face broke out into this wonderful smile that the whole world fell in love with. And he pointed at her and said, "Got you," and reached out and hugged her. And by chance, Howard Bingham, who was Ali's best friend and also his personal photographer, was in the apartment and snapped a photograph at exactly the moment Muhammad reached out, pointed to my mother, and broke into this broad smile. And that's on the dust jacket of the book, on the flap of the book. It's a wonderful reminder of a wonderful moment.
You begin chapter 6 with a quote by the 17th century moralist, Francois de la Roche. "Few people know how to be old," he said. What will readers of My Mother and Me learn from your mother's example about getting older and about realizing that time is finite? As you said, she gets ready to hand that torch off and hopefully leave the world a better place than what she found it.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, one of the themes that resonates in the book is watching someone you love grow old and then very old until there comes a time when they feel that they've lived long enough and the time is near. In that regard, the term golden years can be a misnomer. Larry Merchant, the very insightful broadcast commentator who was a very good writer before he ever started work for HBO boxing, said to me once, getting into your 80s is easy, getting out of them is hard. And yeah, it is hard. There are things we take for granted that as we get older become harder and harder to do. When a light bulb pops, you don't just change the light bulb in 20 seconds. You have to unscrew the old one, walk very slowly to the closet, take out a new one. Just changing a light bulb can take 20 minutes. My mother had a very good old age. She gave people a roadmap for how to grow old. And so, yeah, she knew how to be old, but she knew how to be middle-aged too. Life is a journey, and she figured it out along the way. Her character was always evolving. You know, when you get older, it tends to accentuate who you are. The good qualities become magnified, and the bad qualities become magnified. And growing old, really, she flowered in a wonderful way. And I think part of that was that after her relationship with Buddy, which ultimately was shortened by his contracting cancer, and also her coming to understand that a lot of the attraction there was wanting to be young and in high school again. And then after my father's death, she met a man named Alan Rayfield, and they had 10 wonderful years together. They really did. And that left her with a sense of feeling fulfilled. And there also, as she grew old, that there was another significant change in her life, and that, like a lot of women, some men too, but it was particularly true of women of her era, she defined herself in large measure by the men that she was with. First, my father, who she married at age 19 and was with for more than 40 years, then Bud, and then finally Alan. And after Alan died, she began to define herself more by who she was. And that was a very important step on her journey through life.
Well, one final question now that her life is completed, the book is completed, and people can pick up My Mother and Me. Your mother, Eleanor Nordlinger Hauser, she believed, you said, just what you mentioned there, that immortality lies in how we're remembered and how what we do during our lives changes the world and affects other lives after we're gone. All of us out there are links in that chain of humanity that you mentioned earlier. So I'd like you to make your pitch to readers, and why should they go and pick up the book and get to know your mother, help her legacy continue, maybe give it to their own mother for Mother's Day or for any holiday that comes.
Or a mother could give it to her son. One of the most gratifying things for me about the book is the emails I've been getting from readers who I don't know personally and who didn't know my mother. So there's no personal tie there. People who are writing to tell me that reading My Mother and Me led them to take a fresh look at how they view their own mother or their own son or other personal relationships. And as for making my best pitch, I mean, you read the book, we're talking, so I guess I'd ask you what it was about My Mother and Me that led you to want to explore it further.
I'll tell you, it was that first line. I have to say it hooked me. Plus, she's striking. As you said, the cover looks like somebody who lived such a full life from a long while ago now, almost 100 years, right? Next year will be the 100th anniversary of her birth. And then I read that you were going to be honest with me about her story, that she was a person who encouraged honesty. And I thought, boy, I've lived not as long as your mother, but I've lived over half a century now. And I've had my own stumbles and my own failures and things that I'm ashamed of and angry about that I did wrong. Here's another person. This is why I read history. So I'm glad you asked. Here's a person that can show me a roadmap of how they dealt with those problems in their life. And that's also goes with that whole link of humanity. And I said, this woman has something to say to me, even if it's one thing, and it was more than one thing, that I could pick up from her life, that when I get to that pitfall, I feel your mother tap me on the shoulder and say, no, remember, I made that stumble, or I missed that opportunity, or I seized that opportunity. I could tell from those very first pages that she was somebody who was going to show that to me by reading her life story.
Well, that's nice to hear, and I
hope so.
Yeah, and my mother would love the thought. She would love the idea now that her story is reaching beyond the immediate family. And when I think of how she'd react, I mean, obviously she would like the idea that years from now, her great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren pick up this book and read about her. She went to Fieldston. That was the high school she went to. and she loved it. There's a part in the book that talks about how important that was in inculcating her love of learning. And it would give her a little thrill to know that that book is now in the Fieldston School Library. I got an email telling me that. But just to maybe do some good by people, reading about her, whether it's now or years from now, that would make her happy. And it makes me happy.
Well, Thomas Hauser, author of My Mother and Me, I hope everyone listening will catch my enthusiasm for the book and consider picking it up. It's not just for mothers, not just for sons and daughters, but I think it makes a great gift for anybody who cares about being a better person, avoiding some of those pitfalls in life, but just reading a great story. I think it's really a book for everyone, which may sound like a cliche, but it certainly is not. I absolutely wish you the best of luck with this special, very personal book. And I feel like I should ask you to thank your mother as well, but I'll have to just settle for thanking you. Thanks so much for being here today on the History Author Show.
Thank you for having me on your show. I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope we get to talk together again.
Oh, well, I'll look forward to your second book on your mother.
Okay.
96 years. You can't fit it all in one. Again, the book is My Mother and Me, a memoir. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at the historyauthor.com page for this episode. By buying a book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. Thanks again to Thomas Hauser for making the time to join us and for introducing all of his readers to the singular woman who was his mother. She was many things to many different people throughout that long 96 years that I think the earth was a better place having her around. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do subscribe at our iHeartRadio channel, iTunes, wherever you found the show. Remember to also subscribe on our YouTube channel. All of those are ways you can join us for future journeys in the Wayback Machine. And please do visit historyauthor.com to find my social media accounts, as well as the over 250 interviews I've done with authors. You're sure to find one you enjoy. Well, that's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio or wherever you enjoyed this journey into yesterday. Go to nysun.com, find my review of My Mother and Me. I will also link to that on the historyauthor.com page for this episode once that's published. Well, until that next trip into the past together, on behalf of Thomas Hauser and his mom, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular guys. Oh, New York ain't New York anymore.